Hello and welcome to lesson 1 of week 7. In this lesson, we are going to look at object-oriented programming, classes, and objects. My name is Mildred. Object-oriented programming involves grouping related properties and behaviors into individual objects, and we use something we call classes as blueprints for their creation. And these classes allows us to define functions within them. And so when we define a function within a class, we call this a method. For example, let's say we have a person class. We use this class to define the characteristics and behavior of a person. An instance is an object that is built from a class. So let's say when we create a class called person, it is like an empty form. A form that is not filled out. When we create an object of the person class, we are filling out the form. We create a class in Python using the class keyword written like this, all lowercase, and then a name for the class, which by convention we start with an uppercase. So normally we use camel case when it's more than one word name for the class. So let's say we want to create a class called person. We create like this and a column, and then we define the properties and the method of the class in the body of the class definition. We have attributes. When we define classes, we have something we call an instance attribute, and then we have a class attribute. We create attributes within a class using a method that we call an init method. So let's say we say def. We use the dunder method init, like 2 underscore init and then 2 underscore and a pair of parentheses like this. Within the parentheses, we define all of the attributes for the class, the attributes that differ. For instance, we want to have the name, the sex, the race. These are attributes that differ from person to person. And so when we create objects, we are going to define these attributes for each object of the class. So we have the first parameter of this init method is always self. And we use this self to define new attributes on the object. So we say self, and then the attributes we want to define are, let's say name, we want to define sex, let's say we want to define race also. And then we come here to define self.name is name, self.sex is equal to sex, and then we say self.race is equal to race, like that. So we define these properties like this. Okay, so this has defined the class. We use the init method to create an attribute called name, and then we assign the value of that to this. Let's say after creation of this class, we want to instantiate the class, like create objects of the class. Now we say we have a person called, let's say Jane, for instance. Jane is an object of this class. So Jane is going to be person. So we are calling the name of the class, and then in the parentheses we are going to supply the values for the properties. We want the name to be, let's say, Jane Doe. We want the sex to be, let's say, female. And then we want the race to be, let's say, Latinx. We want to create another person. Let's say this other person is Mildred, and we'll say Mildred is going to be an object of the person class. The name is going to be Mildred. Let's say the sex is female, and then the race, let's say, is African American, something like that. We can create several objects of the same class. So I'll just copy this and let's just make it like 4 different objects of the same class. Let's call this John, and let's say John is a male, and the name is John Smith, and let's say John is like American, and let's call this person Jacob, and let's say we have Jacob Davis, and then this is a male, and let's say Jacob Davis is, let's say, Amerindian. So we have these different objects of the person class. So what we've done here now is to look at how we create a class, which is a blueprint for creating objects. So a class is like a blank form, and the objects which we have just created here when we instantiate the class is to fill out different copies of the same form. So let's say you distribute questionnaires in a classroom. The questionnaires are all blank. When they fill it out and you collect them, each questionnaire contains data. Those data or each questionnaire that is filled out now becomes the object of the Estonia class. So that is one analogy you can always use to remember. So when you define a class, you have this init method that defines the properties of the class. And when you call the class or create an object of the class, you supply the values for those properties that have been defined. So what we have looked at now is called an instance attribute. We have something we call a class attribute that we define, like just after the class definition, we define something we call a class attribute that is an attribute that is the same, that the value will be the same across every object of the class. This instance attributes that we just use is something that the value differs. So all of these is like the instance attributes. But if we want to have a class attribute, let's say for instance, we want to put something like status and want to say we're collecting data for everybody that is alive, like this. So we now know that every single person class created have a default value of alive, and we don't need to specify that. So take note of the difference between a class attribute and an instance attribute. Attributes created using the init method are called instance attributes, and the value of the attributes differ for each created object of the class. The class attributes have the same value for all of the class instance. For instance, now if I want to print out this and I say print, for instance, I'm going to print Jane. So if we want to print out a value of the object that was created, let's say I want to say Jane.race. I want to know the race of Jane. It's going to print out that when I save, and let's run this. I have the race as Latinx printed here. If I say Jane.status is going to be equal to alive printed here, because I already have the default one specified there. So whenever you have class attribute, you specify it just after the class definition, before you start creating your method within the class, like that. So you can have several things, like apart from the status, you can have something like a list. Let's say we have speaks. Let's want to have the set of languages that the person speaks. So I'll say only English should be the default, like this. And if I say Jane.speaks and I clear and run, I'll see that Jane speaks English here as this. But if I want to add something to it, for instance, I say Jane.speaks.append Spanish, like this. And then I print out Jane.speaks this time. You should write English and Spanish there for me as a list of languages that Jane speaks. So we're just looking at classes at the basic form, how to look at the properties of a class and create objects from the properties of the class. We have what we call instance methods, like we define functions inside of a class. We know that defining a function in Python uses the def keyword, like this. So let's say we want to define two functions, for instance. We are going to do something in a non-Pythonic way, and then we'll come and redo it properly. So let's say we want to have a method. It's called a function. A function within a class is called a method. So let's say def introduction, for instance. And so let's say introduction. And then in the parentheses, we want to specify self. Okay? So the functions defined inside the class are called the instance method, and it always takes self as its first parameter. So you can add more parameters. If we don't have any parameter to add, we just leave it as self. And so we can now say we want this one to return let's use the format string, and we'll do something like this. Let's say it returns self.name. So let us say the name of the person is A, and then we'll put self.text, like that, and then we'll say and identifies as, and then we'll put self.race, something like that. And then we can even add and speaks, then we have self. So when we do this and we come and say here, we do something like we want to call that method, I will say Jane dot, because introduction is now the method, I am calling it because it has no parameters here, just self there. And when I run this, I'll clear so you can see properly, and I run this, I will have, so I will leave it on the same line because I think that is where the error is. We need to format. We're going to look later at how to break into a new line, but this generally it was the problem. And so Jane Doe is a female and identifies as Latinx and speaks English and Spanish, because here we appended Spanish to it. Okay, so this is basically how we call this method or function that we created within. So we call the object name dot the method or the function name, and then we supply arguments if we have parameters defined. So in this example, we don't have any parameter defined. Self is always the first parameter that we should have. Let's say we want to have something like def, let's say def age, and this will now take something like self, and then it takes date of birth like this. And then here we're going to define this as return self.name was born on date of birth like this. And so when we say we want to print out Jane.age here, and we supply an argument here to be a date like this, and then when we run, it will say Jane Doe was born on, and the date is supplied like this. So this is an example of how we create functions or methods within a class like this, and it just helps us organize stuff and makes things more maintainable. Now we did this introduction like this, and it prints that. If we do something like we want to print, let's say we want to print Jane, the object Jane, we're going to have this cryptic object at something printed out like this. So we have main person object at and the memory address of that. That's why I said this is a less Pythonic way of doing this. Another way we can do this is to use the string dunder method, since this returns a string. So we can do this instead of having the name of the method to be introduction. We can use the dunder method string like this, and then return self like that. And this way, when we say we want to print Jane, it is going to return the string that introduces Jane without having that memory address. Jane Doe is a female, identifies Latinx, and speaks English and Spanish. Okay? So this is one way we do that. Instead of writing the introduction, we use the string dunder method. We're going to look at magic method in the next lesson, but we are just using them now to look at the general overview of classes. All right. So we have something we call inheritance. An inheritance is the process by which one class takes on the attributes and the method of another class. Now, the newly formed class is called the child class, while the class it inherits from is called the parent class. Let's say, for instance, we want to have another class called, let's say, pet, for instance. I will delete this, and let's say we want to have a pet class. Or let me leave that there, and we'll use that. So let's say here, before this, I'll just go down. We have a class called pet. I'm going to create a new class. I'll say class pet. This pet, I want this pet to inherit the properties and method of the person class. And so I'll put the person in the parentheses of the pet class like this. And then I will now put all of the definitions of this. I want to have the inherit the definition from the parent class. I will just use my def init here. And then I want to have name, the sex, and the race. So I will say self in the parentheses. Self is always the first parameter we have, then all of the properties and method, name, sex, and then we have race like this. But I want to, okay, let's even have something called owner here too. But I want to inherit the definition for the name, sex, and race from the parent class. We use super to indicate the parent class. And so I'll say super, and then init, and what I'm inheriting here is the name, the sex, the race. And then now I can say self.owner is equal to owner to define that. Let's say, for instance, we want to also have a class attribute that is type. I'll put type is equal to, and we'll say dog, for instance. Okay. So I'm creating a new class now that inherits from the parent class called person. We want to inherit the name, sex, race attributes from the parent class. We also want to inherit the method for the introduction and the age from the parent class. And so when we indicate the parent, we use super. Super means like we're inheriting from the parent class. We're taking the properties and the method from the parent class. So instead of me to say self.name equal to name, I'm just taking the definition of these ones from the parent, and then I'm defining what owner is here. Self.owner equal to owner, which is just like doing this. I just indicated it with super here. Okay, So let's say I want to also add the language that the dog speaks. The dog does not speak any language. We have like a default language here, speaks English, and I want to remove that. So I can now do something like super. So I'm just trying to look at the different ways you use classes, the different ways we call the different attributes and the method and the way we use them before we go deeper in creating our software using object-oriented programming methods. So I'll say super dot, first of all, I want to clear all of the language that is there. So I'll say super dot speaks dot clear like this. And then I will now say super.speaks.append backs like that. So in this example now, if I come here to say I want to create a new object here called my pet, for instance, let's say my pet, and I'll call it like pet. And then I want to supply the name, sex, race, and the owner. So I'll say the name here is, let's say, Bingo. The sex here, let's say Bingo is a male, and then the race of Bingo, let's say, is German Shepherd, and then let's say the owner is John, like that, or Golden Retriever, whatever we want to specify as the name or the race. Let's assume that race means the breed of the dog, so we'll just use race as the breed of the dog, like that. And then when I print my pet and I run, I'm going to have Bingo is a male and identifies as Golden Retriever and speaks backs, because when I call the object or the function here, I run the string method that introduces as I've done before. So you see that this class pet that inherits from the person's class is an instance of the person's class. And then sometimes you want to check if any class is an instance of another class. We use is instance method. We can say is instance my pet person. We want to check if my pet is an instance of a person class. It will give us true or false for us to see that because it inherits from the person's class, it is an instance of the class. And when I say yes, it prints this first, and let's say print, and let it tell us whether it is true or false here. And when I run this, it says true because pet is an instance of the person's class, because we're inheriting the person's class here. So this is all about object-oriented programming, classes and objects and inheritance. Go over this lesson over and over again. Try it out. Create different kind of classes. Make scenarios of what a class can be. Remember that it is a blueprint for creating objects, and see what object you can create. You can decide that you want to create a class called hotels, and then you want to create different properties of the hotels, like the name, the address, the number of rooms, or the type of hotel, or things like that. Or you want to create a class called a house, and then you want to create different methods within the house class. Every house has rooms, or number of rooms, or it has door, windows, things like that, and then you define those things. So make up scenarios about what blueprint you are creating, what thing is common. Like you have a car, I know that a car is a general word for different things, and you want to fill things like the model of the car, the weight of the car, the color of the car. Every car has these properties, and so you can have a class called car, and you can have different objects of that class car. You can decide to define different methods like the car speed, the car maybe acceleration, different kind of things that are different attributes of a car or action of a car. We use them as method or behaviors of the car, or the sound of the exhaust, or the sound of the engine, or something like that. Those are behaviors of the car, and then you can use those kind of scenarios to try how to create classes and method of classes. And as we go deeper, we are going to be building our system in object-oriented fashion for us to practicalize the use of class and objects in real-world scenarios. So thank you, and see you in the next lesson.